In mapping out some of these narratives and structures that have developed into the modern day, I've been leading us to this part of the course, which I'm calling the path to genocide. And so many of the strands we've been talking about, colonialism, race theory, and so on, end up here at what I have referred to as the dark void at the center of the 20th century. So with the devastating genocides that took place in the 20th century, we see that a number of these theories that have led us to this point are thrown into question, and increasingly so by the time we move into our time period. So I'm just going to move through some of these ideas, and then we're going to look at the idea of genocide. So, as I mentioned in the written part of this lecture, propaganda was a very important part of the rise of fascism in Europe, and particularly the Nazis had a very sophisticated approach to using media to spread their message. And so just looking at this image, we start to see their ideals in sort of the form of an image. So I saw an exhibit on Nazi propaganda in Washington at the Holocaust Museum, and so there's two sides of it, which is showing the quote-unquote Aryan ideal and then the dehumanizing propaganda against groups such as the Jews. So in this image, I think this is pretty straightforward. So we see everybody's blonde. So this ideal of the so-called Aryan, which, as I said, is pure nonsense, completely made up. But anyway, Hitler took the word Aryan and completely reconfigured it. And so this idea of a perfect race, a master race that could be bred through eugenics. And it's no mistake, the figure of the man is like twice the size of the woman. And so as we're going to be seeing, misogyny is a vital part of fascism. Another important element within fascism is a kind of nostalgia for the past. So the idea of the Volk, the folk, when everybody was farming. And so there is definitely within this movement a reaction against industrialization and all of the incredible turmoil that came along with it, including the rising call for equality between men and women. So we see the fascists looking back to the past towards a supposedly traditional family unit. Whether in fact this was the case is really not the point. This is their version of the past in which they want to revive again. So I want to move now through the characteristics of fascism, and what I find disturbing is that a number of these elements still are with us, and I think we've seen some of it in the turmoil that occurred during the last American election. So I think people are really, and in Europe also, very vigilant around any of these movements rising, and we're definitely seeing rising anti-Semitism in Canada. So let's just work our way through this. So number one, extreme militaristic nationalism. So we talked about that in earlier lectures, this idea of romantic and ethnic nationalism, this idea that there are these natural nation states based on a kind of uniform culture and uniform genetic inheritance. Contempt for democracy and political and cultural liberalism. So this idea of an authoritarian state is central to fascism. A belief in a natural social hierarchy, a belief in a natural social and rule of the elites. So this is really very central to fascism. There's no idea of equality, the idea that social hierarchy is natural and necessary and that the masses should be ruled by the elites. Now, who the elites are in the case of fascism moves from the aristocracy to the leaders of these movements. The desire to create a German people, a community, so that the idea of the nation state becomes much more important than the good of the individual. So here we have the characteristics of fascism as written by Lawrence Britt. So we've already talked about powerful and continuing nationalism, disdain for recognition of human rights. That's pretty self-explanatory. The good of the state always trumps the rights of individuals or minorities in this view. Identification of enemies, scapegoats as a unifying cause. So we see this in fascism. There has to be a group or groups that becomes the enemy of the state, and this allows for the unification of the nation against that group. So in early Nazism, we saw communists and trade unionists as scapegoats, and then increasingly Jews became the main scapegoats of the Nazis. But there were a number of different groups, including the Romani and homosexuals, that were seen as enemies of the state. Supremacy of the military. So all of these fascistic states have military at the center, often with military running the nation. Rampant sexism, I already touched on this. As Guillermo del Toro said, he's a Mexican director who directed the film Pan's Labyrinth about the fascists in Spain. He said, fascism is a boys' game. Control of mass media. So very early on, as I said before, the Nazis were aware of the power of mass media, and they used it very effectively. So we'll continue with the characteristics. Obsession with national security. So the idea that somehow the nation is under threat from both the outside and within. Religion and government are intertwined. This is complex, particularly in the case of the Nazis, because they rejected mainstream religion. They rejected Christianity and replaced it with a kind of bizarre, their version of paganism. But certainly within this, with the Spanish fascists and the Italian, they definitely were cooperating with the Catholic Church. Corporate power is protected, labor power is suppressed. So, as I said before, trade unionists were often victimized by fascistic states. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. This is related to the rejection of liberalism. And of course, I've often asked this question, you know, why were these people always lined up and shot? They seem fairly innocuous, but the fact is that these are the people that question the state. They ask questions, and so they're not tolerated. Obsession with crime and punishment. This is still a feature of a lot of right-wing discourse. I heard some of it during the last election. So this very simplistic idea of the need to punish criminals and with no interest in sort of what causes people to commit crimes, just the idea that you need to punish it. Rampant cronyism and corruption. We know that in Nazi Germany, it was a completely corrupt state. People maintain their positions through who they knew, and fraudulent elections, if there were elections at all. I just want to be clear that the fascist movement was common across the Western world. I think it's very convenient that we usually forget that and we associate it strictly with Germany, Spain, and Italy. But here we have Oswald Mosley, who was a British fascist leader, and he spoke to huge crowds in England up until World War II. Here we have an image of Adrian Arcong, and I will wager none of you have heard of him. He's been very conveniently forgotten and removed from the Canadian record. I stumbled upon him in doing a book review. So Adrian Arkhan was a journalist, a French-Canadian journalist, and he held extremely anti-Semitic views. He was an advocate for French-Canadian nationalism, and he developed a movement he called the Blue Shirts, modeled on the brown shirts of the Nazis. He continued to put forward his fascist views into the 60s, and he called himself the Canadian Führer. So there were also riots in Toronto and what's now called Christie Pits between Jews and fascist groups. So again, I just want to highlight that this was also, it wasn't obviously a majority view, but it was definitely a movement within Canada as well. Here we have another Nazi propaganda image, which, as I said, is the other side, which is the dehumanizing of the Jewish community. And we can see a number of different ways that all of what is seen as being wrong about modernity is equated with the Jews. And so this man is holding a fistful of coins. So this is still an aspect of anti-Semitism. All of these kind of conspiracy theories about Jews running the banks and controlling the economic systems of the world and so on. And so as a threat to the German nation. And then also the hammer and sickle, which is the symbol of the Soviet Union and communism. So this makes no sense at all. So the Jew is a symbol of both communism and capitalism. It makes no sense, but it doesn't matter. This becomes a symbol of this kind of scapegoat for all things that are wrong in the German nation. In this image, we get a sense of another anxiety that's at the center of fascism, the idea of miscegenation, which I talk about in the written part of the lecture, the idea of the so-called mixing of races. And so we see this figure of the Jew menacing with this Aryan woman and all the Aryan children around. So this threat to the purity, the so-called purity of the German nation, as understood genetically. I just wanted to offer this image of the same area that I talk about in the written lecture, referred to by Snyder as the Bloodlands. And so this just absolutely unbelievable number of deaths in this area between the wars as a result of a number of factors that I talk about in that part of the lecture. And so we see Poland here in between Germany and the Soviet Union. And so the Jewish community, very large Jewish community in Poland, and was increasingly caught between these two forces. The Wannsee Conference of 1942 marks a turning point on the path to genocide. The conference is named after a suburb of Berlin, where this conference took place with high-ranking Nazi officials. So it was during this conference that we see the emerging policy of what's referred to as the final solution. And so the idea of the necessity of the extermination of the Jews of Europe. And it's very important to note this was not a foregone conclusion, that in fact there had been many other ideas about moving the Jews to a particular place. There were various suggestions made into parts of the Soviet Union, etc. But it was at this conference that this decision was made to go forward with this process of murderous extermination. As a first step, we see the Nazis basically trying to move the Jews all into one area. And so this is part of the idea that Zygmunt Bauman puts forward, that it's the bureaucracy of the modern state that really allows this to happen, because it can name and number everybody within the state. And so this is the process that the Nazis used. They were very meticulous with their records. They were very bureaucratic. And so the creation of the ghettos had obviously existed before, but we start to see them used as a kind of holding site. Then as this process moved forward, we start to see the walling in of the ghettos and just horrific, horrific conditions within the ghettos of overcrowding, disease, lack of food, and so on. Just completely inhumane conditions that existed within these ghettos under the Nazis. This is, of course, extremely difficult material, and I certainly struggle with it, and hats off to the people that study this all the time as their main focus of research, because it's very upsetting and disturbing material, but obviously it's very important for us to look at it. And when I read Inside the Third Reich, written by Albert Speer, one of the top-ranking Nazi officials who had been jailed for many years, and he wrote this book, and I was very struck by what he says at the end, and I took it as a grave warning So he says, the pure technician, the classless, bright young man without background, with no other original sin than to make his way in the world, and no other means than his technical managerial abilities. It is the lack of psychological and spiritual ballast and the ease with which he handles the terrifying technical machinery of our age, which makes this slight type go extremely far nowadays. This is their age. The Hitlers and the Himmlers we may get rid of, but the spares, whatever happens to this particular special man, will be long with us. So I think he's making a very important point, and Bauman makes this point too, that the kind of demagogues, the Hitlers and the Mussolinis, they're fairly rare, although we've seen some recently, which is terrifying. So that we still have to keep an eye out for that. But this idea that the state itself, the modern technical state, is dangerous, and that we are not equipped as human beings to take on that kind of power that we now have. I'll just give the example of power over nuclear bombs, for instance. So as he notes, many of the people that work in these fields, they have no conception that morality should come into it, that this idea that science is objective, that bureaucracy is objective, and so on. And so he says they have no spiritual ballast, they have no moral discourse around these activities. And so we find this throughout, after the trials, after World War II, people saying, you know, the total cliche, I was just following orders. So the idea that somehow you're not individually responsible. And certainly this is something that I'm very concerned with into the present day, because these factors still exist, and I think we have to take Spare's warning very, very seriously. In looking at this phenomenon, Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, in a number of her books, looks at totalitarianism, and one of her most famous is called Eichmann in Jerusalem, which was published in 1961, that looks at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, so one of the top-ranking Nazi officials. And she was very struck by the fact that Eichmann just seemed like a normal person. You know, obviously, I think within human imagination, the Nazis become these monsters and they should have horns coming out of their head or something. But here he is, this sort of normal-looking guy. How was he capable of these actions? And so she developed this concept of the banality of evil, that a lot of these people were just pushing paper around with no sort of larger concept of the morality of what they were doing. And I think this is a very important concept, that intention in many ways, I think we can get very caught up in intention, but intention doesn't necessarily matter. Actions can lead to this incredible evil without even our intentions being clear. I wanted to finish this presentation with an image of my friend Judy Cohen, who's a Holocaust survivor. And I'm doing this because, as I've said throughout, I think it's so important to remember that these were people that were impacted by these forces of history. They weren't just numbers or statistics. Judy lost much of her family in the Holocaust. She was 14 years old in Hungary when the Nazis took over her country, and she was almost immediately shipped to Auschwitz. She survived, was in a displaced persons camp, and then came to Canada. So I also include this because Judy is one of my great heroes in my life, and whenever I'm feeling that the forces are too strong, or I'm feeling down about the state of things, I always think of her, because the minute she put her foot down in Canada, she started fighting for human rights. She's done countless talks in churches and synagogues and schools. She fought for workers' rights, and she had a whole website, particularly looking at the impact of the Holocaust on women. So I just wanted to end with an image of Judy Cohen, who is such a heroic survivor of the Holocaust.